Somewhere on the coast of what is now California, in the year 1491, a man is sewing a boat together, not nailing it, not carving it out of a log, sewing it, drilling holes along the edges of split redwood planks, threading cord made from plant fibre through them, pulling the seams tight, and sealing every one with a black tar he has boiled down from natural asphalt that seeps out of the ground near his village. It will take him months. When he is finished, it will be about 8 meters long, it will carry a dozen people, and it will be capable of crossing open ocean to islands he cannot see from the shore. He has no metal, not one piece, no iron, no nails, no saw. Every hole in that hull was made with a stone drill and a shell, and he is not inventing this. His father built one. So did his grandfather. The design he is using is older than most cathedrals in Europe. Now hold that image, because I want to put a number next to it. In 1491, nobody knows how many people are living in the Americas. That is not a gap in this video. That is the actual state of the evidence, and it is one of the genuinely unresolved arguments in modern history. For most of the 20th century, the standard estimate for the whole hemisphere was around 8 million. Then, in the 1960s, historians began going back to the earliest colonial records, tribute lists, tax rolls, the paperwork of empires that counted people because they wanted to charge them, and the numbers started climbing. Badly. Some serious estimates now run past 100 million for the hemisphere. Read those two figures again. 8 million, 100 million, the same continent, the same year, the same profession, and a disagreement of more than a factor of 10. That is not a small academic quibble. It is the difference between a sparsely settled wilderness and one of the most populated regions on Earth. It changes what 1491 was, and nobody has closed it. So we are going to spend tonight walking through a world whose population we cannot count, on a continent where, and this is the part almost nobody knows, there were more languages being spoken than in all of Europe. Not dialects. Languages, as separate from one another as English is from Arabic, in families with no relation to each other at all. Estimates run to well over 300 distinct languages north of Mexico alone, and that fact alone destroys the picture most people are carrying. Because you have a picture. Everybody does, and nobody chose it. Tipis, a horse, a feathered headdress, buffalo on an open plain, one people, one look, one way of living, spread across a continent. Here is what is wrong with that image in 1491, and it is not a matter of nuance. There are no horses, none, not one horse anywhere in North America. They will not arrive for another 200 years, and when they do, they will transform a handful of nations beyond recognition. But on the morning we are visiting, the entire continent travels on foot and by water. Most people do not live in teepees. They live in plank houses, in earth lodges dug into the ground, in stone rooms, in bark-covered dwellings, in adobe. A great many of them live in the same building their grandparents were born in. And most of them are farmers, not hunters roaming after game. Farmers with fields, with stored surplus, with harvests they plan a year ahead. The picture in your head is not a picture of 1491. It is a picture of a specific handful of nations, in a specific narrow window, after Europeans arrived and after the horse changed everything. It is roughly as accurate as describing all of Europe by showing someone a photograph of a Scottish piper. So here is what tonight actually is. We're going to cross the continent, east to west, in the year 1491, 1 year before, and we're going to look at what is actually there. We will start on the Atlantic coast, where shells are money and the value depends on the colour. We will go into the southeast and stand inside a political entity so large that when Europeans finally walk through it 50 years later, they describe town after town after town and could not find the end of it. We will go out onto the plains and find people living in permanent villages of packed earth, farming river bottoms, hunting on foot with dogs. We will go into the desert southwest, where a people had already built irrigation canals hundreds of kilometers long by hand through rock. Canals so well engineered that a modern American city is using some of the same routes today. We will reach the northern Pacific coast, where nations became wealthy without agriculture at all, and where the measure of a man's status was not what he owned but how much of it he could give away in one night. And we will come back to the man sowing his boat. Now, a word about the evidence, because it matters more here than in almost anything else I have covered. There is no writing, not in the sense a European archive would recognize. Everything we know about 1491 in North America comes from three sources: archaeology, oral tradition carried forward by descendants, and the earliest written descriptions by outsiders, which arrived decades late, from people who did not understand what they were seeing. So when I give you a number tonight, I will tell you how solid it is. When historians disagree, I will say so rather than picking the one that makes a better sentence. And there is one thing I am not going to do. I am not going to tell you these were people living in a peaceful garden. There were wars, there were empires that collapsed, there were nations who dominated other nations, cities that failed, famines, and violence. Everything that happens anywhere on Earth where people live in large numbers over long periods. Treating them as gentle innocents is not respect. It is a different kind of erasure, because it takes away the thing that actually makes them interesting. They were doing politics. One last thing before we go, and it is the strangest fact I know about the year 1491. The trade networks crossing that continent were enormous. Copper mined near the Great Lakes has been found more than 2,000 kilometers away. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico turn up deep in the northern interior. Volcanic glass from the mountains of the west has been found far out on the eastern plains. None of that moved on a wheel. There were no draft animals. Every single one of those objects was carried on a human back or in a canoe, handed from one nation to the next, across hundreds of years, through territory belonging to people who spoke completely different languages. And when the first Europeans reached the interior of the continent, they thought they were entering unknown country. They were walking on roads. They just could not see them, because the roads were not made of stone. They were made of relationships, of agreements, and marriages, and debts, and old arrangements between families who had been trading for longer than most European kingdoms had existed. So, let us go and walk them. We are starting on the Atlantic coast on an ordinary morning 1 year before the ships. If you're here to relax and fall asleep, you're in the right place. And if you enjoy the video, leave a like and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and I read every comment. And now, let's begin. Start on the Atlantic coast, in the country that will one day be called New England, on a morning in early spring. The first thing you would notice is that it is not wilderness. There are fields, large ones cleared and planted running back from the shore. There is woodland behind them, but it is open woodland. You could ride a horse through it, if there were horses, because the undergrowth has been burned off deliberately and repeatedly for generations. That last part matters, and almost nobody knows it. The forests of the eastern seaboard in 1491 were managed. People set low-controlled fires under the trees on a cycle to clear brush, encourage the plants that deer like to eat, make travel easier, and make hunting practical. When Europeans arrived a few decades later and described a beautiful park-like landscape, they were describing the result of centuries of work and assuming it was natural. The villages sit near water, and they are substantial. Frames of bent saplings covered in bark or woven mats. Warm, weatherproof, and quick to repair. Some are single family. Some are long and hold several families and their fires. In winter, communities move inland to sheltered ground and come back to the coast when the fish run. And the population along that coast is not small. Village after village close together, each with cleared fields around it, along hundreds of kilometers of shoreline. When Europeans finally came to settle there permanently, some of them wrote about finding cleared and abandoned fields ready to plant, and did not always ask why the fields were cleared and the villages were not occupied. And the fields are the interesting part. They are not planted in rows of one crop. They are planted in mounds, and each mound holds 3 plants growing together: maize, a bean, and a squash. That combination is one of the most elegant pieces of agricultural engineering anywhere in the pre-modern world, and it was worked out here. The maize grows tall and gives the bean something to climb. The bean, like all legumes, hosts bacteria in its roots that pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil, which is exactly what maize strips out, so the bean feeds the field that feeds it. The squash spreads across the ground below, its broad leaves shading out weeds and holding moisture in the soil, and its prickly stems discouraging animals. 3 crops, 1 mound, each solving a problem the others create. No plough, no draft animal, no fertilizer. And nutritionally, the 3 of them together make a complete protein, which maize alone does not. A field like that can feed people indefinitely without exhausting the ground, which is more than could be said for a great deal of European farming at the same date. Now, the money. Along that coast, people made small tubular beads out of shell, white from whelk, and a rare deep purple from the quahog clam. They were drilled, polished, and strung, and they were enormously labor-intensive to produce, especially the purple, because the purple part of a quahog shell is small and brittle, and most attempts break it. Those beads carried value, and the value was not decorative. They were used to seal agreements, to pay compensation, to record obligations, and to mark treaties. A string of them was not a receipt for an agreement. In a world without writing, it was the agreement, held and remembered and produced when needed. Purple was worth several times white, for the plain economic reason that it took several times the work, and that is a real currency by any definition worth using. It has a unit, it has denominations, its value is anchored to something, labour, rather than to a promise. It is durable, portable, divisible, and hard to counterfeit, which is the entire list of properties economists ask of money. The only thing it does not have is a state issuing it. It is backed by agreement instead, held across nations that could not speak to each other, and that agreement held for a very long time. So on that coast in 1491 there is a currency, with denominations backed by labour and social consensus, functioning across nations that do not share a language. And when Europeans arrived and worked out what it was, they did the entirely predictable thing. They started mass-producing it with steel drills, flooded the system, and destroyed the value of it within a generation. But that is later. In 1491, the strings are being made by hand, 1 bead at a time, and a man in a coastal village can tell you the exact worth of the one around his neck. Now go south and inland into the river country of what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. Here you find something that does not fit any category most people have available, and I want to build it up slowly because the scale is the point. The landscape is agricultural and it is dense. Villages sit along the rivers surrounded by fields. But every so often you come to something much larger, a town built around a plaza, and rising from that plaza, an artificial hill, not a burial mound. A platform, flat-topped, steep-sided, built by hand out of carried earth, sometimes 10 meters high or more, sometimes considerably more. On top of it sits a building, the residence of the ruling family, or a temple, or both. Everything about the arrangement is deliberate. The elite live literally above everyone else. Ceremony happens on a stage the whole town can see. The plaza below is kept flat and open and swept, and these were built by people carrying baskets of earth. No wheels, no draft animals, no metal tools. Every cubic meter of those platforms was dug with wood and shell, carried on a human back and set in place. Season after season, generation after generation, on a scale that required organized labor and somebody with the authority to organize it. Now, here is the part that reframes it. 50 years after 1491, a Spanish expedition marched through this region, the first Europeans to see the interior southeast, and their chroniclers wrote about a domain so large that they simply could not find its boundary. They walked for weeks, town after town after town, all acknowledging the authority of the same paramount ruler. Fields, granaries, tribute moving inward, a hierarchy of settlements, principal towns, secondary towns, villages, organized in a way the Spanish recognized instantly, because it looked like the political structure of a European kingdom. They called the ruler a cacica in one famous case, because the person governing the province they had entered was a woman, and she came out to meet them carried on a litter by her own people. And the details in those accounts are specific in a way that is hard to dismiss. Granaries holding stored maize in quantities large enough to provision an army of several hundred men and their horses for extended periods. Towns with defensive palisades and gate towers, roads between settlements, ceremonial buildings on the platforms, a ruling class that travelled with attendants and expected to be received formally. The Spanish were not sympathetic observers, and they had every incentive to describe the people they were fighting as primitive. They described a state instead, because that is what was in front of them. That was 1491's world still running. By the time anyone came back to look properly a century later, most of it was gone. The towns were empty. The platforms were overgrown. Whole provinces the Spanish had walked through had no successor. So the first sustained European description of the interior southeast is also, in effect, the last description of it as a functioning world. And I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a documentary usually reaches for a single dramatic cause. The honest position is that historians and archaeologists are still working out the relative weight of the factors involved, and the arguments are ongoing and technical. What is not disputed is the before and the after, a dense, organized, hierarchical agricultural world in 1491, and within a few generations, a landscape of much smaller and differently organized communities, with the great platform towns abandoned. That is one of the largest transformations in the history of the continent, and most people have never heard that the first state existed at all. Go west now, out of the woodland, onto the grass, and here is where the picture in your head has to be taken apart completely, because almost everything most people associate with the Great Plains is wrong for 1491. No horses, as we said. No tipis for most people. No great mounted buffalo hunts. None of it exists yet. What is actually there is farming villages, along the river valleys that cut through the plains, the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas and their tributaries. People live in permanent settlements of earth lodges, and an earth lodge is a serious building. Picture it. A circular pit dug into the ground, a frame of heavy timber posts and beams above it, then willow, then grass, then a thick packed layer of soil over the whole thing. From outside it looks like a smooth dome of earth, with a smoke hole and a covered entrance passage. From inside it is a large open room, big enough for an extended family, their stored food, and in bad weather their dogs. Building one is a community project. The main posts are heavy timber, dragged in from river bottoms, and raising the roof frame takes many hands at once. In most of these societies the lodge belongs to the women of the family and it is inherited through them. They are warm. Astonishingly warm. That soil layer is doing exactly what a modern architect would want it to do. Enormous thermal mass, holding heat through a plains winter that regularly goes far below freezing, and staying cool through a summer that goes far above it. They last for years, and when one wears out you build another. And around those villages, fields, maize, beans, squash again, plus sunflowers grown for oil and seed. The river bottoms have deep soil and reliable water, and the people farming them have been developing varieties suited to a short, harsh growing season for a very long time. So the plains in 1491 are not empty grass crossed by wandering hunters. They're a network of farming towns along the waterways, with grass in between. Hunting matters enormously. Bison represent more meat in one place than anything else on the continent. But it is seasonal work done on foot, in organized groups, using terrain and fire and coordination rather than speed. Communities leave the villages for the hunt and come back to them. The heavy hauling is done by dogs on frames of poles. Now hold that picture next to the one in the films, because the gap between them is one of the strangest facts in American history. The classic plains world, the horses, the mounted hunts, the mobile camps, is not ancient. It is a response to the arrival of an animal from Europe. It comes into existence after contact, spreads across the plains in the space of a couple of generations, and lasts roughly a century and a half. The thing everyone pictures when they picture Native America is one of the newest ways of life on the continent, and it was made possible by the very people whose arrival ended it. In 1491, none of that has happened. In 1491, there are villages of earth and fields of maize and people walking. Keep going west into the desert of what is now southern Arizona, where the summer temperature routinely goes past 45 degrees and the rain, in a good year, might total 20 centimeters. This is the least promising farmland in North America. There are cities here, not villages, substantial settlements in the desert, supporting large populations for over 1,000 years. And they exist because of one of the most impressive engineering projects anywhere in the ancient world, which almost nobody outside the Southwest has ever heard of. They dug canals, not ditches. Engineered canals taking water out of the Salt and Gila rivers and carrying it tens of kilometers across the desert to fields. The total network over the centuries it was extended and maintained ran to hundreds of kilometers of channel. Now think about what that requires, and remember what they had to work with. You need to survey. A canal has to fall, continuously, gently, over its whole length. Too steep and the water accelerates and tears the channel apart. Too shallow and it stops and silts up. The gradient has to be right over tens of kilometers of desert, with no obvious slope to the eye. They got it right. repeatedly, with no surveying instruments in the sense we would recognize. You need to dig it through hardpan and rock, with stone tools, wooden digging sticks and baskets, moving an amount of earth that has been estimated in the millions of cubic meters. You need to maintain it forever. Canals silt up. Every year, the whole network has to be cleared. That is an enormous, permanent, coordinated labor obligation, imposed on thousands of people, indefinitely. And you need to allocate the water. This is the part that is not engineering. When one canal serves several communities, somebody upstream can take everything. The fact that this system ran for centuries means there was a functioning arrangement, an agreement, and some way of enforcing it, governing who got how much and when. That is water law, in a desert, without writing. It is difficult to overstate how hard that particular problem is, because we still have not solved it. Water allocation between upstream and downstream users is one of the most persistent sources of conflict in the modern American Southwest, with courts, treaties, federal agencies, and decades of litigation. They ran it in the same valley for something like 1,000 years, and here is the detail that closes it. When American settlers arrived in that valley in the 19th century and wanted to irrigate, they looked at the ground, found the old canal lines, and, in several cases, simply cleaned them out and used them. The modern city of Phoenix sits on top of that network and takes its name from the idea of a city rising from the ashes of an older one. Some of the water moving through that valley today is following a route somebody surveyed by eye 1,000 years ago with a stick. But by 1491, the great canal cities are already past their peak. Something happened in the 15th century. The largest settlements were being abandoned or drastically reduced before any European set foot on the continent. The most commonly discussed explanations involve some combination of prolonged drought, catastrophic flooding that damaged the canal intakes, salt building up in irrigated soil, and the social strain of maintaining a system that demanded that much coordinated labor year after year. Archaeologists are still arguing about the weighting. Nobody argues about the fact. So when we visit 1491, this region is not a story of a civilization at its height. It is a story of people living in a landscape that still bears the marks of something bigger, in communities that are the descendants and inheritors of it, which is worth sitting with because it undercuts a very persistent idea that the pre-Columbian Americas were static, unchanging, outside of history until Europeans brought history with them. They had already had their own rises and collapses, their own arguments about water, their own generation looking at ruins and wondering what happened. And that is not unique to the desert. It is the pattern across the continent. The great platform centers of the Mississippi Valley had risen and declined on their own schedules. Settlements in the southwest had been founded, occupied for generations and left. Populations moved, merged, split, and renamed themselves. Every one of those events was somebody's entire world ending, long before any sail appeared on any horizon. Now go north up the Pacific coast, into the country of rain and enormous trees, and everything you have learned tonight about how societies get wealthy stops applying. The standard model is simple. Agriculture produces surplus. Surplus allows specialists. Specialists produce complexity and art and hierarchy. Farming first, everything else second. The northern Pacific coast produced one of the wealthiest, most stratified, most artistically sophisticated regions on the continent, and it did it with essentially no agriculture at all, because it had salmon. Every year, in enormous numbers, salmon come back from the ocean into the rivers to spawn. They arrive on a schedule, They arrive in the same places, and they arrive in quantities that are difficult to convey. Enough in a good run that a community can take what it needs in a matter of weeks. The catch is that it is a matter of weeks. A year's food arrives in a short window and then stops. So the entire society is organized around one problem: preservation and storage. Fish are split, dried, and smoked in enormous quantities. Cedar boxes are built to hold them, and the boxes themselves are a technology, made by scoring and steaming a single plank until it bends into 3 right-angled corners, then sewing or pegging the last joint. Watertight, made from one piece. That bent wood technique is worth dwelling on because it is genuinely clever engineering. You cut 3 grooves across a single plank, steam it until the fibres soften, and bend it into a rectangle. So 3 of the 4 corners have no joint at all, because the wood was never cut through. Only the 4th corner is a seam. The result is a box that will hold liquid, made from one board, with a single join to fail. That storage is what makes everything else possible. A community with a full smokehouse in autumn has a winter free. And what they did with those winters is the reason the art of that coast is world famous. Monumental carving, house posts, masks, screens, and enormous canoes hollowed from single cedar trunks, some of them large enough to carry dozens of people on open ocean. The buildings are plank houses, big enough to hold several families and their belongings, framed with beams that took whole communities to lift, and the canoes deserve their own moment. The largest were made from a single western red cedar, a tree that can grow to enormous size on that coast, felled without metal, hollowed by controlled burning and adzing, then spread, filled with water, heated with firestones until the wood softened, and forced wider with cross pieces until the hull curved out into its final shape. The result was an ocean-going vessel that could carry dozens of people and tons of cargo, and could handle open water on one of the roughest coastlines in the world. And the society is not egalitarian at all. There are clear ranks, high-status families, commoners, and people held in servitude. Rights are owned. The right to fish a particular spot, to sing a particular song, to display a particular crest. Those rights are inherited and defended and disputed. Which brings us to the institution that made European observers lose their minds, and which is one of the most interesting things in this entire video. Status there was demonstrated not by accumulating wealth, but by giving it away. A family would hold a great feast, invite other communities, sometimes for days, and in the course of it distribute an enormous quantity of goods to the guests. Food, blankets, boxes, tools, objects of value. The host ended the event with dramatically less than they started with, and that was the point. The giving was the claim. It witnessed and validated the host's position, their inherited rights, their names and titles in front of everybody who mattered. The guests, by accepting, acknowledged the claim, and they were now obliged to reciprocate in due course, at a level that matched or exceeded it. It is a system where wealth is converted into standing, and standing is maintained by continuing to convert. To a European trader, this looked like madness. A rich man impoverishing himself deliberately. To the people doing it, a man who hoarded goods and never gave a feast was not wealthy. He was simply somebody with a lot of objects and no standing at all. There is detail inside this that I find perfect. In some communities, the feasting could escalate. 2 rival families going back and forth over years, each giving away more than the last, each event a public claim that had to be answered. A European looking at that saw waste. What was actually happening was closer to a very expensive election, conducted in goods instead of votes, and settled in front of witnesses. 2 completely coherent economic logics, meeting, and neither able to read the other. That, more than any single battle or treaty, is the shape of what is about to happen to this continent. And now we come back to the man on the California coast, because it is time to finish his boat. He belongs to a people living along the channel between the mainland and a chain of islands offshore. Islands that are visible from high ground on a clear day and are a long way out on any other kind of day. What he is building is called a tommel, and it is one of the most remarkable objects made anywhere in North America before contact. Here is the problem it solves. You have redwood, enormous, straight-grained, buoyant, and rot-resistant, which is close to a perfect boat-building timber, but you did not grow it. It grows hundreds of kilometers to the north, and it arrives on your beach as driftwood, washed down rivers and along the coast over years. So your raw material is a lottery. You have no metal. You cannot saw a plank, so you split logs with wedges of bone and antler and stone, then work the surfaces down with abrasive stone until they are flat and even. You cannot nail them together, so you drill. Along every edge, a line of holes, made with a stone-tipped drill spun between the palms, through hardwood, one hole at a time. Then cord made from plant fibre threaded through seam by seam and drawn tight. Then it has to be waterproof, and here the coast provides something specific. Natural asphalt seeps up out of the ground and washes up on the beaches. Heated and mixed with pine pitch, it becomes a tar that seals every hole and every seam. Then sanding, then painting, then months of work in total. And what you have at the end is an ocean-going vessel that can cross more than 30 kilometers of open Pacific with a dozen people and a cargo. The crossings were regular. Trade ran constantly between the islands and the mainland. Shell beads out, mainland goods in. And the shell bead currency of that region was produced on those islands in industrial quantities, drilled and strung and traded far inland. The people who owned and captained the boats formed a distinct and respected group, with their own knowledge and their own standing, and building one was a specialist trade that took a lifetime to learn. Now step back and look at the whole coast in 1491, because the tommel is only the sharpest example of a pattern. That region was, in population terms, one of the most densely settled parts of North America, and almost none of it farmed. It did not need to. Acorns, processed to remove the bitterness, provided a storable staple crop that grew itself. Fish, shellfish, game and seeds did the rest. Hundreds of separate communities, dozens of mutually unintelligible languages within a few days' walk of each other. Permanent villages, complex trade, elaborate craft, and essentially no agriculture anywhere in it. The idea that farming is the necessary first step to a complex society is a theory built by people looking at one part of the world. Two entire regions of the Pacific coast disprove it, and both of them are running perfectly well in 1491. We have crossed a continent. Now let us slow all the way down and spend one day in it, because the scale is easier to feel from inside a house than from above a map. Morning. You wake in a building your grandmother was born in. Earth lodge, plank house, bark house, adobe room, depending on where we are standing. It is dark inside, and it smells of wood smoke, because it always smells of wood smoke. Somebody has already woken the fire. Fire is not lit fresh each morning. It is kept, banked down overnight under ash and brought back with kindling before dawn. Starting a fire from nothing is possible, and it is work, and in most households it happens rarely because someone is always responsible for the coals. The first meal is usually not a meal in the sense of everyone sitting down. It is a pot that has been going, and people eat from it when they are ready. Work. And the thing that most surprises people is this. The work is highly specialized, and a great deal of the specialized knowledge is held by women. Farming, in most of the agricultural nations of the East and the Plains, is women's work. And by farming I mean the whole intellectual apparatus of it. Which seed from which plant is kept for next year, which variety suits which soil, when to plant against the signs of the season. In many of those nations the fields are held by women, inherited through women, and a man marrying in has no claim on them. That is not a decorative detail. It is a property system, and it produced a level of authority over food and household that startled the first European men who encountered it and did not know where to file it. Toolmaking, hideworking, pottery, weaving, basketry, all specialized, all requiring years to learn properly. A good basket in some of these traditions is watertight and can be used to cook in by dropping fire-heated stones into liquid inside it. Children learn by being present. There is no school and no separate world of childhood. A child is in the room while the work happens, handed small versions of tools, given real tasks scaled down, corrected by whoever is nearest. Discipline is the detail that Europeans consistently found remarkable and often disapproved of. Across a wide range of these societies, children were very rarely struck. Correction came through teasing, through story, through shame in front of relatives, through withdrawal of approval. European observers wrote about it, sometimes admiringly, more often as evidence of a dangerous laxity. And it is one of the sharpest cultural differences recorded in the early contact accounts. Evening. Dark comes, and the fire becomes the centre of the room again, and this is when the transmission happens. There is no writing, so everything a community knows, its history, its law, its geography, its agreements with neighbours, its origin, its practical knowledge of medicine and weather and season, is stored in people and moved by voice. That means memory is not a casual faculty. It is trained deliberately from childhood, and in some nations it is a formal specialism. Individuals whose responsibility is to hold particular knowledge exactly and pass it on without drift, often with others present whose job is to correct any error. An oral tradition maintained properly is not a game of whispers. It has redundancy, checking, and consequences for getting it wrong. And it has anchoring devices, physical objects that fix the content, a carved stick, a knotted cord, a belt of beads, each element corresponding to a section of what must be recited, so the object and the speaker check each other. The item is not writing, but it is not decoration either. It is an index. A person can be handed one of those by an elder and be expected to reproduce, in order, an agreement made before they were born. And some of it has been shown to be startlingly durable. There are oral traditions on this continent describing volcanic eruptions, floods and coastline changes that geologists have since dated to thousands of years ago, carried, in some cases, for 100 generations, and turning out to be accurate. That is what is happening around those fires, not just stories. The archive being maintained. I said at the start that when Europeans walked into the interior of this continent, they were walking on roads they could not see. Now I can show you what I meant. Start with a single object, a sheet of copper. The copper of the Great Lakes region is unusual. Most copper in the world occurs as ore, locked into rock requiring smelting to extract. Around Lake Superior it occurs native, pure metallic copper, sitting in the ground in nuggets and sheets, and occasionally in masses weighing tons. That means you do not need metallurgy to use it. You need a hammer and patience. Cold hammer it, anneal it in a fire when it becomes brittle. Hammer it again. You get sheet, and from sheet you get beads, plaques, ornaments, blades, and that copper has been found more than 2,000 kilometers from where it came out of the ground. Now the other direction. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, large marine species that only exist in warm salt water, turn up deep in the northern interior, hundreds of kilometers from any ocean, worked into ornaments and cups. Obsidian, volcanic glass, which takes an edge sharper than surgical steel, and which comes only from specific volcanic sources, has been traced from western mountain sources to sites far out on the eastern plains. Geologists can do this precisely because each obsidian flow has a unique chemical fingerprint. You can pick up a blade found 1,000 kilometers away and name the mountain it came from. Turquoise moved north out of the southwest. Pipestone moved out of the northern plains. Marine shell from the Pacific moved inland. Dried fish, hides, salt, tobacco, feathers, food, and finished goods of every kind moved along the same lines. An obsidian is worth stopping on for a second because of what it is. Volcanic glass, formed when lava cools too fast to crystallize. Fracture it correctly, and the edge that comes off it is measured in molecules, sharper than anything made of steel, sharp enough that surgical blades have been made from it in modern experiments. A person on the eastern plains holding an obsidian blade in 1491 is holding the single sharpest object it was possible to own anywhere on Earth at that date, and it came from a mountain 1,000 kilometers away that they will never see. And every single item was carried on a human back or in a canoe. No wheels, no horses, no oxen, no sail on the interior waterways. A person walked it, or paddled it, and then handed it to somebody else who walked the next stretch, which tells you something enormous about what those networks actually were. They were not trade routes in the sense of a road with traffic on it. Almost nobody walked 2,000 kilometers. What moved that distance was the object, passed hand to hand across dozens of separate transactions, through the territory of many nations, over years. For that to work, something has to be in place at every single handover. An agreement about who may pass, a price, a relationship, often kinship, because in many of these societies trade ran along family lines, and marriages were how you made a trading partner into a relative. So the network is not made of paths. It is made of arrangements, and every one of them is maintained by people who know each other, and it has been operating long enough that copper reaches the Gulf and shell reaches the lakes as a matter of routine. Ideas moved on it too. Maize itself moved along those lines out of Mexico and had to be rebred as it went, because a plant adapted to a long southern growing season will not ripen in a short northern one. Every step north required generations of selective breeding by farmers who never met the farmers who had done the step before them. That is a continental agricultural research program, run without writing, over centuries, by people separated by hundreds of kilometers and dozens of languages, and it is worth being clear what maize actually is, because it is one of the great human achievements, and almost nobody treats it as one. Its wild ancestor is a grass with a handful of small hard seeds on a tiny spike. It is not food in any useful sense. Turning that into a plant with hundreds of large soft kernels on a thick cob took thousands of years of deliberate selection by farmers choosing which plants to keep. Maize cannot reproduce without people. The kernels are wrapped in a husk and will not scatter. Left alone in a field, it simply dies out. It is an artifact, a living tool, designed by human beings over millennia, and it is the reason there were cities on 2 continents. The maize growing in a field beside the Great Lakes in 1491 is the end product of it. So when a European party pushes into the interior and reports discovering unknown country, they are walking through the middle of a functioning system that is older than their kingdoms and completely invisible to them, because it has no visible infrastructure at all. There is nothing to see. It is all held in relationships. Now I want to be honest about the harder part, because leaving it out would make all of it worthless. One retelling of this turns 1491 into paradise, a continent of peaceful people living in harmony with each other and with the land until Europeans arrived and ruined it. That version is comforting, and it is false, and being false it is also, I think, insulting. There were wars. Nations fought each other over territory, over hunting grounds, over trade access, over revenge, over the ordinary reasons humans anywhere have ever fought. Some of it was raiding. Some of it was sustained conflict between organized polities. Fortifications exist in the archaeological record. Palisades, ditches, defensive placement of villages, and settlements that were burned. There was hierarchy. In the platform mound societies of the southeast, the distance between a ruling family and an ordinary farmer was enormous and hereditary. On the northern Pacific coast, rank was inherited and there were people held in servitude. There were captives, taken in war, across many regions, with outcomes ranging from adoption into a family to lifelong servitude. And there were environmental consequences, because there always are. The forests of the east were shaped by deliberate burning. Large-scale irrigation in the southwest salted its own soil. Populations grew and outran their land and had to move or fight or change. Every one of those things is what happens when large numbers of people live somewhere over long periods. It is not a mark against them. It is a mark of them being a real, functioning, historically normal set of human societies, which is precisely the claim that gets denied when they are romanticized. The garden version does the same work as the wilderness version. Both remove them from history. One says there was nothing here. The other says there was something here, but it existed outside of time, without politics, without conflict, without change, until history arrived on a ship. And there is a practical cost to the romantic version that people rarely notice. If you insist that these societies were static and harmonious, then every piece of evidence of conflict, hierarchy, or environmental impact becomes something to explain away or hide, which means you end up arguing with the archaeology and eventually losing. Whereas if you simply accept that they were ordinary human societies, doing ordinary human things at scale, the evidence stops being awkward. It becomes the record of a real history. Both are ways of saying these people were not doing anything. They were doing everything. They were building canals and arguing about the water. They were negotiating trade rights and breaking the agreements. They were founding towns and abandoning them. They were inheriting property and disputing the inheritance. They were maintaining a treaty their grandparents made and deciding whether it still served them. That is history. It was already running at full speed in every direction in 1491, which brings us back to the question I put in front of you at the very beginning, and which we now have enough context to take seriously. How many people were living here? I told you the estimates run from around 8 million to well past 100 million for the hemisphere. Let me show you why that gap exists, because the reason is more interesting than either number. The low estimates come from counting what was seen. For most of the 20th century, the standard approach was to work from early European descriptions and from archaeological sites that had been excavated. Explorers described what they encountered. Missions and colonial administrations counted people they governed. Add it up carefully. apply reasonable multipliers, and you arrive at a modest figure. That method has one enormous assumption inside it, that what Europeans saw was what had been there. The high estimates come from questioning exactly that. Because of a timing problem, Europeans arriving in the interior of the continent did not arrive at the same moment as the changes that followed contact. Trade goods, animals, and, crucially, the biological consequences of contact travelled along those invisible networks we just spent a section describing. They moved along kinship lines and trade routes at the speed of people walking into places no European had been. So there is a real possibility, argued seriously by serious people, that the first detailed European accounts of the interior are describing a landscape that had already changed, and that the sparseness those accounts record is not the original state of things, but a consequence of contact that arrived before the observers did. If that is right, then counting from those accounts is like estimating a city's population from a photograph taken after most people had left, which is why the modern high estimates rest on different evidence. The scale of the agricultural earthworks, the sheer number of village sites, tribute records from regions where administrations did count, and the amount of land under management. And the argument is not settled. Some of the highest figures have been criticised as resting on multipliers that compound. Some of the lowest are criticised for taking colonial-era observation at face value. The mainstream has moved substantially upward over the last 60 years and has not stopped moving. Here is why I care about it, and why I have made it the spine of tonight. That number is not trivia. It determines what you think 1491 was. If it is low, the continent was a lightly populated frontier, and the story of what came after is the story of settlement. If it is high, genuinely high, tens of millions in the hemisphere, then 1491 was one of the most populated regions on Earth, and the story of what came after is something else entirely. And there is a second thing riding on the same number, which is the landscape itself. If a great many people were farming, burning, irrigating and managing land across two continents for thousands of years, then what Europeans later described as pristine wilderness, untouched forest, endless grassland, nature as it had always been, was nothing of the sort. It was a managed landscape whose managers had gone, which means the whole 19th century idea of an untouched American wilderness may be in large part a description of a garden after the gardeners left. The difference between those two pictures is the largest open question in the history of this hemisphere, and it is being fought over right now in print between researchers looking at identical evidence. That will not be resolved here. It is not going to be resolved anywhere for a long time. But you should know that when someone tells you confidently how many people were here, they are choosing a side in a live argument, and they usually will not tell you that they are. Let the breathing go slow now. We're at the end of the crossing. It is late in 1491. Somewhere off the coast of Africa, in a harbour we're not going to visit tonight, preparations are being made for a voyage. That is not our story, and I am deliberately leaving it on the other side of the ocean, where it currently is. Because here is what I actually want you to take from this. I should qualify the phrase last ordinary year, because it is doing something slightly unfair. It was not last for everybody, and it was not the same year everywhere. Change reached different parts of the continent decades and in some cases centuries apart. There are places where life in 1600 was recognisably continuous with 1491, and places where it was not. What is true is that 1491 is the last year in which none of it had started anywhere. Nobody in this entire video knew they were living in a last year. The man finishing his sewn boat on the California coast is planning next season's crossings. A woman on the Atlantic seaboard is choosing which maize to keep back for seed and setting the purple beads aside for a payment that is due. Somewhere in the southeast, a ruler on a platform is receiving tribute and thinking about a neighbouring province. In an earth lodge on the plains, somebody is banking a fire for the night. In the desert, a work party is being organised for the annual clearing of a canal that their great-grandparents also cleared. None of them is waiting for anything. None of them is a prelude. They are in the middle of their own lives, in societies with their own politics and their own histories and their own unresolved arguments, on an ordinary evening. That is the thing the phrase "the New World" removes, and it is why it is such a strange phrase. It was not new. It was, for everybody in it, extremely old. A great deal of what we walked through tonight was already ancient by 1491. The maize had been bred and rebred for thousands of years. The oral traditions carried events from before the pyramids. The canals had been running for centuries. The trade networks predate most of the nations of Europe, and a great deal of it had already risen and fallen once, without any outside involvement at all, because that is what happens to human societies everywhere. Underneath all of that sits something smaller, and I think it is nearer the truth. None of this was built by civilizations. It was built by individual people doing specific things, and almost none of their names survived. Somebody worked out that beans and maize belong in the same mound, and was right, and told other people. Somebody surveyed a canal gradient across 40 kilometers of desert with no instrument, and got it right, and the water arrived. Somebody held a body of knowledge in their memory perfectly for a lifetime, and handed it to a younger person who did the same, over and over, for so many generations that a description of a volcano still matches the rock. Somebody drilled the last hole in a redwood plank and pulled the cord tight, and pushed a boat into the Pacific that they had made out of driftwood and tar and patience, and it floated. They were not preparing for anything. They were just doing the work in front of them, well, the way people do. The islands he was sailing to are still there tonight. The channel between them and the mainland is doing what it has always done, and the swell comes in from the west the way it did in 1491, and in the last few decades people descended from those villages have built tunnels again, by hand, in the old way, with sewn planks and tar, and paddled them across that same water, which is the only ending this story actually has, not a disappearance, a continuation, with a long and difficult gap in the middle. The descendants of every nation in tonight's crossing are here. The languages that survived are being taught. The people are not a chapter that closed. If you got something out of tonight, alike takes no time, and it is very nearly the whole reason a story this slow ever finds its way to anybody. Subscribe if you want the next crossing to turn up by itself. A different continent, a different century, some other world that was far busier than the short version we all inherited. And put your town in the comments, along with the hour where you're sitting. I get through them. Now set it down. The fire is banked, the boat is finished. There is nothing else to cross. Good night.